Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the great introduction. As Lola said, the title of the talk, Signal to Noise, is also the title of a book that we're working on. So this is a bit of a lecture, a bit of a kind of test drive to see if it sort of works as a structure. So there's the book project. Signal to noise, what does that mean for architecture? Our contention was that we could use a kind of term from communication theory to think about architecture. We've often said that architecture needs to consider media and material together, but signal within a kind of field of noise is a kind of discernible, recognizable, legible communication from a kind of sender to a receiver. How does that work for architecture? Our argument is that in today's sort of accelerated, sort of superabundant, sort of data-rich world, the noise aspect is overwhelming, and increasingly it's harder to find cultural producers. Did that just go? Okay. As cultural producers, we feel that thinking about practice in this digital age is really about sort of finding ways to communicate clearly a signal within a kind of cultural backdrop of noise. So communication theory, we've been interested in this sort of idea of broadcast, and we've argued that architecture is a kind of a form of broadcast. It tends to consider audiences. It tends to sort of create a kind of low definition broadcast. And if you think about how people use space, the kind of dependence or addiction to devices, the kind of perpetual distraction means that every moment that we're living, we're sort of living between an update. Our time is sort of sliced up between updates and notifications. And so it really sort of fragments our attention. And as architects, we might argue that part of our job is to sort of cultivate a kind of attention span, a kind of an attention within a kind of greater field of distraction. In fact, it's hard to sort of escape, what's happening, on those TVs, on those screens. It's so pervasive, it's sort of always coming through our devices. When do we think about architecture as broadcast? Could we go back to a certain moment where the state-of-the-art architecture was enlisted to produce certain kinds of effects? I'm talking about Gothic architecture. And for Gothic, the idea that structure, material, color, light, sound, smell was all sort of directed towards one objective, the kind of persuasive aspect of space in the context of institutions like religion, that this might have been the sort of original sort of architecture of media and the architecture of persuasion. How do we think about that sort of in modernity? And I think Walter Benjamin, famously said that architecture is always experienced in a state of distraction. Whereas art might be framed on a wall, it might be in a gallery, architecture is always competing with the city, with the horses and the carriages and all those distractions with the commercial information for your attention. And so that sort of quote from Benjamin sort of stuck with us, and we said, what do we need to do as architects to sort of cultivate a kind of attention within this field of distraction? Benjamin, famously argued that the modern city had produced different modes of behavior, new practices and new sort of personas like the flaneur or the window shopper, the new sort of modern subject. And so when we think about Benjamin and his flaneur, I'm imagining it's this guy right here, sort of in Paris, in the 1930s, sort of impressed by all the commodities that are on display in the windows. These are competing for their attention and their money. What would Benjamin think about our sort of lived reality, our kind of media landscape? And I try to think about Benjamin's flaneur sort of walking down the street in Times Square and how this flaneur would be entranced by the kind of phantasmagoria of the contemporary. So thinking about architecture playing this role, whether it's a kind of cultural broadcast or a kind of commercial broadcast, architecture has been enlisted to persuade us to believe in this brand or that brand. This is the PSFS building that famously was one of the first skyscrapers with a kind of billboard on the top. Fast forward to today, where every building seems to be outfitted with color-controllable lights that turn green on St. Patrick's Day or purple when Prince died, or was it the Queen's birthday? We don't know. In fact, I think those two coincided, and everything turned purple, and people said, yes, it's Prince, but in fact, it was actually, I think, the Queen's birthday. So signals are getting mixed up And it's really, as we know from communication theory, it's really dependent on the receiver. It's not really about the kind of true sort of broadcast between a sender. It's really in the sort of receiving subject's hands. But architecture, and this is a project I worked on at KPF actually, architecture has become a kind of 100-story billboard that produces these ghostly images that animate skylines and sort of compete for our attention. This future of a kind of media-saturated cityscape, urbanscape, has been envisioned, in movies like Blade Runner, and we're sort of big fans of science fiction. The new Blade Runner sort of updates that sort of image of the cityscape as a kind of pervasive surface of broadcast. And looking at the contemporary city, we see media facades proliferating, facades that no longer have the kind of boundary of the kind of the frame of the screen. The frame of the screen has dissolved into our sort of information landscapes and come into our other interfaces. So as we think about the way we practice and the way we work, how do we think about these surfaces as interfaces? And could we argue that architecture is itself a kind of interface? That when we think about the way we interact with the world, it's also about a kind of augmented screen, an augmented surface. And some of our first projects were thinking about how we could produce architectures that had overlays of information, in this case a kind of pixel net that was responsive to the user, to the visitor. Also, I think we've all been conditioned to believe that our devices are touch sensitive, that the interactions with communications technologies, with information, will become more and more gestural, less about hardware, and become more and more sort of natural, that every surface will become responsive and touchable, that the Internet of Things will sort of make everything networked. And I think that's a kind of exciting opportunity. A lot of our early work sort of began with speculating about these futures, many of which have actually sort of come to pass. But the question about public space and information and devices, I think fundamentally our public realm has been transformed by these surfaces, these interfaces. How we interact with each other has been transformed, how we interact with buildings, how we interact with government. All these things have been altered. The question is, what's still fundamentally distinct about the public realm? What can still be surprising, unexpected, serendipitous? And this image sort of resonates today probably in a different way than it did before. But we are interested in how people behave, and that's something that we didn't really think about in architecture school. We sort of talk about form and light and material. We never thought about this, this kind of spontaneous happening, how people interact within the public realm. So a lot of our sort of thinking has gone from buildings to behavior, and thinking about how can we sort of think about architecture as a platform for behaviors, whether they're entertainment, whether it's a spectacle like the Pompidou example, or a kind of platform for political expression and representation. Our first project, maybe Mijin's first project, began in 2001 when she was teaching at MIT. She took a class called How to Make Almost Anything. And I think as a faculty member taking a class, that was kind of unusual, but she thought at MIT it would be great to sort of see what MIT is about. So she did this project for the class. It involved a microcontroller, a sensor, and some smart materials, shape memory alloy. And so this defensible dress was equipped with a passive infrared sensor. And so when you get too close, it sends a kind of electrical charge to the nitinol, which contracts, and like a tendon, it sort of actuates. And so this dress was, it was not meant to be fashion. People said, well, you're interested in fashion. Well, we're interested in space. We're architects. So this is architecture to us. This is about personal space, public space, and technology in public space. So this early project in 2001, I think, sort of launched a whole set of inquiries about the public realm, about technology, about behavior. The same technology that we used for the defensible dress, we used in Athens in 2004. I was just talking to Lola about these early projects that really sort of set us on a path with a set of ideas and maybe some technologies. For the Athens Olympics, there was a competition to design a public space. This is the Acropolis. At the base of the Acropolis, a field of lights that would respond to you. So we pitched it as this responsive fiber optic field. Being at MIT, we had a sense that we could figure it out. You know, we didn't know enough about it, but we could figure it out. And the dress emboldened us to sort of pitch this idea. We spent some time figuring out how to make it, how to build it, how to solder it, how to program it. The concept was a field, when you walk through, it leaves a kind of trace. So the field sort of registers your passage. There's some early video footage with some white noise. When you trigger the lights, it emitted white light and white noise. And so here's people sort of walking from front to back in the field. And you hear the kind of the sound of the shh sound of the speakers actually sort of tracing the path. Here moving sort of left to right across the field. And they kind of masked out the sound of the city. Oh, that audio is pretty good. Usually it's pretty subtle. And then watching people interact with this piece was really sort of eye-opening for us. We thought people would sort of wander through and sort of enter and exit, but they just sort of wandered in, and then they just sort of stayed there. They tried to figure it out. And so even how we conceptualized it, like, would it be playful, would they have fun in the space, they actually tried to figure it out. They tried to, like, learn about how it works. So very quickly we learned that, you know, we thought they would behave one way, they actually behaved a different way. And that sort of human nature can be so unpredictable in terms of how people actually use public space. This was the microcontroller, the outdoor speaker that we made ourselves. And the fiber optic was tied to a sensor and a LED and a speaker. That was the sort of technology. Fast forward to about 3 years ago, we still do projects that are sort of about communication, about representing something unseen maybe. So a few years ago, the General Services Administration, the federal government, basically asked us to do an art piece on the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S.-Mexico border has 26 lanes. Apparently you can wait 6 hours to cross the border. And so they wanted to sort of build a new border crossing. And part of the federal government's public art budget was dedicated to site-specific installations. So in this context, we said, would it be interesting if you were waiting there in a car, as cars move through the border, we could sort of broadcast that. And basically, the idea that you're sitting there and you're going, is the line moving? You don't think it's moving. But if there was some sort of broadcast that said, yes, you know, a car went through lane 24, a car went through lane 25. So could we sort of broadcast the simple passage of a car across the border? And so that idea we sort of translated into some programming, and we installed one line of light. It's 1 pixel high, and it's 500 feet long, so it's a kind of extreme aspect ratio for a screen. But whenever a car goes through, there's a kind of burst of light that sort of ripples through this field, or through this line. That concept we pitched to the GSA. They liked it, and so we installed it on this border crossing. This is such a simple idea. It's like the border is fluid. You know, people live on one side and they work on the other side, and they cross this border every day. And in a way, you know, broadcasting the simple passage of people across a national boundary doesn't seem like a grand gesture or kind of artwork, but it does, I think, acknowledge the kind of everyday reality of the border, which isn't a kind of militarized, well, it is a militarized zone, but the kind of anxiety and the xenophobia that's sort of emerged around the border, where it's somehow this impregnable fortress, where in fact lives are lived on both sides of this border, and it is a fluid thing, and making that fluidity legible, I think, was part of the project. This was, of course, before Trump was elected. Part of our writing in this book, Signal to Noise, has to do with the signal and the kind of idea of communication and content. The other aspect has to do with material, and so media and material sort of in parallel. We've done a number of projects. This one is in China for a building, so not electronic, not censored, not Internet of Things, but an email came through, so in a way, kind of global telecommunications, asking us to design a parcel in Site G. And this was this might have been 2001 or so, 2002. We couldn't really believe it. We weren't sure, you know, where this was coming from. We were in communication with the architect, and he said, well, we'd like you to build a building on 2 conditions. 1, it's a traditional courtyard house, and 2, that it have pitched roofs. And we said, we think we can work with that. And so we studied the traditional courtyard house. it seems very clear that there's a kind of pavilion, which is a figure, and there's a kind of fabric, which is a field. And so the role of architecture within this sort of compound is really sort of somewhere between figure and field. We pitched an idea of a kind of sloped wall as opposed to a sloped roof with these sort of courtyards. And this was the first scheme that we presented to the client in Chengdu. This was the scheme. It's a courtyard house. It's got pitched walls, not pitched roofs. It's ultimately a kind of flat top. This was our first meeting with our scheme in the corner there. These were the 7 other architects that were part of the group. And the client absolutely hated it. He hated all of it. He told us we were all going to get fired. So he sent us back to the drawing board and said, none of these look Chinese. And he said, I really want you to sort of translate the Chinese feeling into this project. And I said, what's Chinese feeling? I don't know. My mom's Chinese. I asked her. She's like, well, you can't really draw it. You can't really sort of specify it. It's not like a single thing you can do to make it Chinese. But the client did, I think to his credit, send us on a kind of trip. We went to Suzhou. We sort of visited gardens. We went to the Ermei Mountains. We climbed the mountain. We were standing at this mountaintop at 5 o'clock in the morning. And my colleague said, that fuzzy stuff out there, that's Chinese feeling. That stuff. And I was sort of trying to figure out, like, so what do we do with that? How do we capture that and sort of put it into our drawings? But we did work with them. We sort of modified the spaces. We modified the modules. We introduced different courtyard proportions. And we developed a scheme that we felt pretty good about. It does have more of a kind of a roof line. It did have a series of punched windows within these opaque surfaces. There was more of a feeling of a kind of boundary condition with gardens inside and the idea of pavilions sort of occupying that space. It was really about going from figure to field, I think, and finding something legible that the developer could recognize. We produced our drawings and our details, we submitted them, and then we waited. We waited for about 9 months, and nothing happened. And then one day they said, congratulations, the project's moving forward. We said, great. We'd like your drawings in 2 weeks. We said, wonderful. But 2 things, we've changed the site. We said, okay. But the site's different, so we've mirrored your plan. Is that okay? I said, fine. And it's changed program. It's not going to be a restaurant, right? And we're like, oh, and one more thing, it's already under construction. So, so this was a big shocker that they had started and they didn't tell us. They'd changed the program, they'd mirrored the plan, and they'd started building. Classic work in China, right? So we took our site plan and we put it on the new site, and then we flipped it. And I can see why they thought this sort of fit, but we sort of said, let's adjust it. So we actually tapered it a little bit differently to get it to fit the new site. And that fits a little better. We did modify our plans. We sent it to them in 2 weeks, and it actually changed again from a kind of live workspace to a restaurant to an exhibition hall, and it landed on exhibition hall. So these were the plans of the different courtyards, the different sort of service zones, the circulation as we imagined it in the exhibition hall. We did do a lot of sharing Rhino models to sort of communicate with the local design institute who was coordinating the structure. And we were trying to locate certain transfer beams before they built them. And sure enough, they were building them. They were building them super fast. And so I went out to Chengdu, and sure enough, there it was. It looked somewhat familiar. I could sort of recognize where the stair was in our plan. I could recognize the courtyards. But they were building it a little bit different how we imagined it. They were introducing their own sort of design innovations. And at the end of the day, they built it pretty close to how we drew it. I mean, we drew it with gray brick. We drew it with what we had specified as wood, sort of window surrounds. They changed it to Corten, which had a kind of a different effect, but also, I think, a quite rich sort of color. We amplified the windows to make them into larger figures. And we sort of specified so there's the detail with the wood. And this is the Corten. So when we went to visit it, we were so impressed that they built it sort of more or less the way we drew it. Not less is more, but more or less. And the details were pretty clear. When they asked what it was going to be made of, we said, how about that brick that's everywhere in Chengdu? the gray brick. And the design innovation was maybe the brick is always oriented the same way. So rather than turn it to the building, it's always like on the cardinal direction. And so this is a kind of north-south wall, and this is a wall that's a little bit oblique. And so it sort of registers how far away from the cardinal directions it is. And so so there's the concept, the compass. We did 2 sheets of drawings, basically showing like an east-west wall with a taper, a taper and a taper, 2 tapered walls. And so I was just showing you that wall over there. But with this drawing, they could take it to a Chinese mason and say, just keep the brick this way. And it didn't require lots of details, lots of templates. It's just like, keep it straight. And so they actually built it sort of as we drew it. So there's that wall, the corner, the flat one, and then the tapered one. 2 kind of tapered walls coming together. And so we thought, like, what can we do in China that we can't do in the States? You know, we could ask for this incredibly labor-intensive brick detail, and they executed. And at the end of the day, the client said, yeah, it has that Chinese feeling. I get a Chinese feeling when I look at it. It's not Song or Tang. You know, I can't quite put it on a particular dynasty, but I do get that sense of Chineseness, which was so difficult to sort of imagine as designers how to sort of achieve that. I think the materiality and the labor certainly helped. But we ended up somewhere that was legible to him and still contemporary for us. And I think that was the sort of huge compromise and the kind of huge lesson of sort of working in a kind of emerging kind of global practice with these questions of localism and globalism. How do we find something that sort of resonates for both? So this is the kind of the chapter that we're sort of shaping about materiality and talking about means and methods. We did a memorial for a police officer at MIT a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember the Boston Marathon had this explosion. There was a terrorist attack. After that, a police officer was killed on MIT's campus, Sean Collier, and it produced a kind of spontaneous memorial. And sometimes these are so interesting, so sort of informal. The university asked a professor to think about how do we think about memory and memorialization in the age of kind of the digital, but also for MIT. Like, what's appropriate for MIT? And they asked, could it be digital? Could it be information? I just noticed this walking down the street, that they actually were using the highway signage to sort of create a kind of ephemeral memorial. And MIT had this sort of, their motto is mens et manus, like hand in mind, which is, I think, quite appropriate. They added fortis, strength, and there was a campaign of like MIT strong, Boston strong. And we thought, what is strength? And how do you think about strength and a memorial? And so this is the site where his police car was parked when he was killed. This is Frank Gehry's status center. And how do you create a contemplative space in front of this building, right? So that's another sort of challenge. So we thought about the police officers wanted a star, they wanted flag, his family wanted a forest or a boulder, something to signal kind of being outdoors. And we thought about MIT and the hand in mind, and so we said, what if we take a figure and we sort of intersect it with another figure, like the boulder that they were requesting, and then we sort of remove that boulder. And so removing a kind of figure from another figure, a kind of Boolean operation, produces what we call the conspicuous absence. So when you go to the site, you see this sort of intersection of two figures, and one figure is sort of barely sort of outlined by these sort of buttresses. That was the concept that we presented. We also imagined it as a series of 4 or 5 rooms, sort of meeting in the middle. The rooms actually sort of frame views, and one of them frames, in a way, the boulder that's sitting there where his police car was built. And you can see the status center in the background trying to sort of imagine how can we sort of screen and sort of create a sense of semi-enclosure sort of in the face of all that sort of architectural sort of spectacle. So here's the kind of moment of sort of a frame view as you sort of move through this sort of vaulted space. That was the concept that we pitched. They asked, well, what do we make it out of? And we said, solid stone. Could it be built like an arch, like a vault, like a traditional stone arch, but asymmetrical and 5-sided and irregular? So we pitched it with John Oxendorf, who's an MIT professor whose specialization is masonry, Hauke Jungehan, who's the engineer from Nippers Helbig, and Sam Morelli from Suffolk Construction. We sat around with these models and we said, can we build a 5-way, irregular, asymmetrical arch today out of solid stone? In a way, this is like super archaic technology. It's so archaic that nobody knows how to do it anymore. On the other hand, we have all the tools at our disposal. We can build it we can calculate it, we can fabricate it, we have all this technology, right? So we went through this incredible design process where the structural engineers, there were five different structural engineers, arguing about how to calculate the loads within a full compression structure. And the argument that John Oxendorf made was that if it's all compression, then the software that you're using that it relies on tension and compression doesn't know what to do with that. And so they were getting values and outcomes that were contested. And so the engineers sort of duked it out. And for us, as architects, we were sort of trying to facilitate this discussion. We said, surely engineering could come to a kind of singular opinion about how appropriately to structure this. In fact, all 5 engineers had 5 different opinions. And in the end of the day, the engineer that won was the engineer of record, right? The design engineer in Stuttgart didn't win. The engineer of record who stamped the drawing said, I want belts and suspenders. I want compression and the possibility of tension, not post-tensioning, but dowels that would sort of pin these blocks together. What we understood is that forces were going to be moving and traveling through the buttresses, and these forces could be calculated. It's the weight of the block, basically. As it tries to fall, it's jammed by adjacent blocks, and those blocks take that weight and they turn it into a thrust. And so calculating that sort of basic set of vectors through the stone was something that they would do in a way very graphically. We developed some tools in Rhino to sort of calculate weight, volume, and vector. And so with some MIT students, we sort of worked on the calculation for these blocks, extending or shortening the buttress walls to sort of calibrate for the thrust of the weight of the block. So this was kind of interesting. We designed it ultimately to be made of 32 unique blocks. Each of these blocks relied on the adjacent blocks to transfer load. We convinced MIT that it had to be solid. We didn't know what a veneer stone meant. So we went to the quarry, we picked the blocks, we sized the blocks based on the sizes that we were looking for, sometimes quite large. And the stone industry is set up to sort of slab, stone for countertops, right? And so we're asking for solid blocks. And so we had to get special blocks out of the quarry. But we did spend a lot of time at the quarry, finding the blocks with the fabricator, ensuring that they would sort of fabricate the blocks properly. We fabricated this in Wisconsin with Cora Stone. That's not too loud. What we learned about digital fabrication is we have such faith in our tools. We know our tools are super precise because we work with them. We can expect a kind of margin of error of less than a fraction of a millimeter because we can draw it that way. Doesn't mean they can make it that way. What we learned with the engineers is that fit was so essential. When you're relying on friction to transfer load, if a block slips by a half an inch, it could lead to sort of the collapse, right? Because there's a ratio of 1 to 6. 1 inch horizontal displacement is a 6 inch vertical displacement. So critical fitting of these blocks. We couldn't have, and we had to transfer loads from face to face. We didn't want any sort of concentrated loads, which could cause a block to crack or to fail locally. So the precision of the robot was something we're sort of determined to sort of maximize. And the design really sort of relied on this sort of perfect fit. What we learned working with these fabricators is that just because the saw started out as a 3-meter diameter doesn't mean it ends as a 3-meter diameter. Every time it cuts, it wears, right? So it's cutting the stone, but the stone is cutting the saw. And so the saw is diminishing in dimension as it's cutting. And so how do you know where the saw is when it's coming across that piece of stone. And every time it cuts, it gets smaller. And so you think you're being precise to the kind of fraction of a millimeter, but the saw blade is actually changing in size. So that was kind of sort of mind-blowingly revealing about the sort of fabrication process. What they do actually is they recalibrate the dimension of the saw as they pass. Okay. So that was kind of the lesson from the fabricator. This is the robot sort of carving one of the larger blocks. And when we got to site, we realized that there's a duct bank here that wasn't on the drawings, which was supplying all the power and data to MIT. So luckily, we didn't have any piles that were sort of conflicting with that, but that was, we built on a sort of empty patch, and the empty patch is exactly where they put the duct bank. So we had to really span around it. So we weren't just talking about spanning, we literally spanned. The blocks are all unique. They were carved in Milwaukee. Here are the blocks arriving on site, and we insisted on stone that had a kind of figure, right? If it was a kind of monolithic sort of black granite, it wouldn't have that figure. You wouldn't see the kind of three-dimensionality of that figure as you moved around the block. So we really wanted something that would sort of showcase its sort of unique qualities, its sort of massiveness, and its sort of sculpturalness. Here's the blocks arriving. We actually started with the keystone, K1. I thought that arches were built from the outside in, and then you put the keystone in last, right? That's how I thought about it. And in fact, that's how they were done. But if we had these critical alignments, 5 faces times 3 because of the step, we needed 15 surfaces to be perfect. And we felt that that was too hard to do at the end of the process. Better start with the keystone and then build out so that we shed any tolerance to the edges where they're less critical. So another lesson from this. This winter that we installed it was like the most snow that we'd ever seen in the history of Boston. And so we were sort of fighting the snow to erect this project in time for the anniversary, which was April 13th. So a kind of insane construction schedule. All the scaffolding to support the stone. When the scaffolding came down, it was instrumented by some PhD students at MIT. They were measuring any sort of movements, any deflections. And they also put all the scaffold on these digital scales, and so they could read the weight of the stone on the scale. And so your structural professor will say, well, you can't see force. Like I look at that column and I can't see the force in it, right? But you can measure it. And how do you see arching action? You measure it as you lower the scaffold under the keystone. The weight on that scale diminishes, and the weight on all the adjacent scales, goes up, right? So how do you see force? In this case, how do you measure it? They were sort of monitoring it in real time. And so as the scaffold came down here, that weight transferred. And then as those scaffolds came down, that weight transferred. And so these engineers were so excited about seeing arching sort of happen. And all these guys were standing there all day for about 8 hours as they lowered the scaffold to see what would happen. Would it stand? Would it creak? Would it deflect? Would it displace? In fact, it displaced, just a sort of fraction of an inch, maybe a 16th of an inch. But it actually worked. It worked, and everybody was ecstatic because nobody knew, exactly how it would behave. Engineering is sort of anticipating material futures, but there's always something unpredictable, and so. That was the Collier Memorial. It was completed just in time for the 2nd anniversary. It does occupy this sort of unique location on campus, which is a kind of gateway between the university and the city of Cambridge around it. And to design a memorial, you sort of have to sort of imagine like who's going to read it and who's going to read what into it. For the police officers, it looks like a star. For MIT, it could be a hand. And we said, in the face of terrorism, what does the hand do? Does it sort of clench up like a fist, or does it sort of remain open? And this idea of the open hand was something that we talked about. And even the lights are sort of arrayed on a kind of constellation pattern that was the kind of pattern of stars in the sky the night that he was killed. So designing memorials is about designing meaning, but not like a singular meaning. It's actually sort of layering meanings into a form or a series of forms that might be read differently by different people. So someone might read that as an arch, someone might read that as a piece of robotic masonry. So that's one sort of important lesson from this project. Working with unique materials, materials that we didn't know enough about, that we had to sort of work with experts. So just because we're talking about interdisciplinary or kind of expanded practice doesn't mean we don't believe in expertise. You know, we really believe in expertise. We believe in it so much that we try to do things with experts so that we can learn about how to do unusual things. This was the memorial service. This is Sean Collier's brother. He was also the site contractor in the field, so he was sort of engaged with it every day. Okay. It really does have this sort of, you know, you feel like there's something that was just there and now it's missing. And this surface is flamed and this surface is honed, and so there's a kind of a smoothness to that sort of cut surface that's distinct from the kind of the other faces of the memorial. We do a lot of projects in public space, and partially because those are the commissions we can get as a young practice, but also because there are opportunities, I think, to sort of make something meaningful and powerful in the public realm. So a few years ago, we did this project in Phoenix, Arizona. It is incredibly hot, and so how do you get people to interact in a climate like this? We thought maybe we need to make place, and making place means making shade. And so how do we think about shade, but also shadow? And could we design something that's designed to make shadow? So we sort of tested out a kind of unit that might sort of not block out all the sun, but sort of let some of the sun through and create distinct patterns on the ground. And so we went from a kind of private parasol to a public one, thinking this might be a way to sort of get, you know, people in Phoenix to sort of interact with each other. So we designed one sort of canopy, one sort of parasol. And we noticed how people tend to line up in the shade. You know, this is Mexico City. So thinking about building and behavior, how do people use space? You know, if we made a bigger flag, would people sort of gather in different patterns? Would they start talking to each other just because they were both sort of in the shelter from the sun? We proposed a series of these canopies along Roosevelt Row in Phoenix. And this is really a traffic island, but we thought, could we make that traffic island into a place that would slow you down, that would encourage you to sit and linger for a moment. And so from the unit to the sort of aggregation, we sort of proposed this sort of clustering. Looking at the sort of sun angles, we sort of proposed a steel plate as a kind of steel origami that could sort of aggregate. We fabricated this in Phoenix. And from different points of view, it's like very open, and from other points of view, it's very opaque. And so the kind of directionality of it, I think, is meant to sort of shield from the sun, but also allow for a sort of natural ventilation, but also to sort of cast certain shadows on the ground. So it's not about absolute shade, it's about sort of distinct shadows and casting shadows on that ground plane. And so now when you go there, if you go there, I think the combination of shading and seating start to transform a place of sort of circulation and movement into something that might actually be inviting enough to sort of linger in. We also took advantage of the sun to sort of create some PVs and some illumination, just to sort of make it more attractive at nighttime, because the city wasn't going to provide any additional power, so it's kind of off the grid, sort of self-reliant. I'm showing a few of these sort of public art projects that also have a kind of material investigation attached to them. So a few years ago, we were asked to do something fun and active at the Lawn on D, which is a privately owned park adjacent to the convention center. And we pitched the idea of a swing set as a kind of playful space. We said, well, adults don't play enough. So maybe we could sort of create a kind of space where adults and kids would find the opportunity to be playful. These swings have a microcontroller in them that knows when it's tilting, and so when it tilts it turns pink, and then when it's normal it turns blue. And so this was just a little bit of feedback that makes the swing responsive, but also incentivizes swinging. If you need an incentive to swing, there it is. You can change the color of the light. This was the first year it was installed. Basic swing, basic microcontroller, a lot of enthusiastic swingers. But we never know how people use these, and we're astounded to see how people actually occupy the things we design. So the first year it's made out of sheets. It's cut on the CNC in our shop, welded together, and sort of like this. The cross section is pretty robust in terms of a kind of structural form. And the fact that it's made out of polypropylene means that it's completely translucent and a great sort of transmitter of light. And so this was the first generation. The second generation, we actually molded it using a rotomolder, which is an amazing thing. You create a mold out of aluminum, you sort of pour the sort of granular plastic in, it goes into an oven, and then it sort of tips it around, and basically the plastic coats the inside surface of the mold. So when they pull it apart, it's a uniform thickness of about 3/16 of an inch all the way around. So finding sort of innovative fabrication techniques to make things that we're interested in. This is what they use to make sort of kayaks and outdoor furniture. There's the kind of the tilt switch between blue and pink. The first time, people were taking lots of photographs. The second year we added the PVs to make the power sort of a local source off the grid. And then people really kind of showed up. They really liked it. It was hard to get a seat. When I go there, I can't get a seat. And they used it in ways that were not recommended. We had to make signs saying, some do's, but lots of don'ts. And you can't imagine the don'ts that people are doing. So she knows she's not. I didn't break any rules. Yeah, but so it's really kind of popular. And I sometimes look on Instagram to see like who's posting, and everyone's posting an image, a selfie on the swing. So even the Blue Man Group. I noticed Delta is using it in their advertising campaign. So I think it's a success. When people are sort of taking selfies in it and they're doing other things in it, building behavior, that's what we're doing. Okay, so the last chapter in the book, we talked about, human nature, we talked about nature, we talked about ecology. We were struck by this image. This is Hurricane Sandy that sort of knocked out power in lower Manhattan. This was taken by Iwan Bond. He rented a helicopter, right after the storm. And it's so striking to see Manhattan dark, right? I mean, Manhattan is the city of, that never sleeps. I think for us, this moment sort of demonstrated the kind of vulnerability of our cities, the need for thinking about cities in terms of resilience, in terms of energy, in terms of sea level rise. It wasn't even a great it wasn't a super powerful storm, but it knocked out lower Manhattan. So that's a huge lesson for all of us. What can we do about climate change with architecture and urbanism? Images of Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy are kind of surreal. They're kind of amazing. And when you think about it, these disasters are happening more and more frequently. And so what are the kind of things that we should be thinking about in terms of planning, in terms of architecture? It's not just about a kind of a quick fix or a high-tech solution. I think it's really about changing human behavior. And so how does human technology affect sort of these outcomes? How does human behavior affect energy consumption? And we talked a little bit about eco-literacy. Can we create a literacy among people so that they read their environments, so they start to understand their own footprint within their environments? A long time ago, we did this project, which was a kind of a gesture towards thinking about environment and literacy. So for MIT's 150th birthday, we were asked to do an installation, and we fabricated a windmill, thinking if we could make a better windmill, a windmill that was not just a technical artifact, but actually a kind of sculptural artifact, could we sort of change the kind of discourse about wind power? In Massachusetts, believe it or not, wind power is controversial because they see it as a kind of destruction of a natural beauty of the landscape or something. So we said, well, could we design a more beautiful wind turbine? Could it sort of make wind energy visible and therefore legible? We did lots of tests. We thought if it could just spin just fast enough, it doesn't need to be optimized, but I kind of like that one. We didn't go with that one. We went with that one. But making wind power beautiful, making it legible, I think that was the sort of idea. And so this is I.M. Pei's green building at MIT. It's a skyscraper. It's famous because when the building opened, no one could open the doors because there was so much wind pressure on the doors that it wouldn't let you sort of open it. So the wind was sort of rushing through this opening and creating all this negative pressure on the doors. So we installed this installation, 400 little wind turbines, making the wind visible for people, making wind power legible. Unfortunately, a lot of people walked by and said, "Where's the computer? How are you controlling this?" It's just individual turbines responding to where the wind is actually flowing, and it's actually flowing, right through the middle. You notice the ones on the edge weren't spinning very much. So a kind of modest gesture towards the idea that we can train people to see and read their environments. Recently, we've been working on this project, which is called Float Lab. It's in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia, you may know, is a city of two rivers, a kind of industrial waterfront. There's the Delaware and there's the Schuylkill, and you can see this historic map how the waterfront is really the kind of the starting point of the city. Our site is on the Schuylkill here somewhere, and the Schuylkill sort of connects to all this coal country. And so if you think about where does energy come from, it's super abstract. We don't know where energy comes from. It just comes out of the socket. But if you look at energy infrastructures and sort of where energy comes from, all the coal coming out of northern Pennsylvania is coming down the Schuylkill River, and it's being processed right outside of Philadelphia. And so this sort of energy landscape, what Meijin calls petro-metro, is what sort of shaped the sort of city, and it shaped its growth and its economy. It was so polluted it caught on fire at some point. And so in the 70s and 80s, this was remediated and cleaned up, and the Schuylkill River today is a success story. And there's an idea that can we just bring people back to the waterfront? They don't remember the kind of urban nature that used to flow through their city. And so this idea of there's the plant and the sort of processing, can we make this river ecosystem legible to the citizen? So this idea was to sort of, can we create a new kind of intimacy between a formerly polluted river and a kind of newly remediated river? Can we bring kids and high schoolers to the river to do some outdoor learning? So we partnered with Bartram's Garden, which is a botanical garden. They will do outdoor learning programs on this barge. At the same time, it provides this sort of moment where everyone can sort of immerse themselves in the river, experience it at eye level, and sort of come away with different perspectives of what does it mean to be in the city, what does it mean to be a kind of urban nature, and an urban nature that's been sort of significantly manipulated and modified by human activity. So easy enough, we pitched it to the Philadelphia Mural Arts, which is our client. We said, submarines basically fill their tanks with water in order to submerge. And so we said, here's the idea. We tested it in the sink. And then we worked with a naval architect who calculated the amount of ballast that would sort of fill the chamber in order to control capsize the submarine. We learned about reserve ballast, and that's the ballast of air that you need in case this chamber fills with water. We don't want it to go straight to the bottom. And so here's a kind of diagram of the chamber filled with water and the kind of reserve ballast still above the water level. We paid $50,000 for a mock-up. We had a firm in Philadelphia weld it up and then drop it in the river. And then we tested it. We had a little bit of a failure, which we fixed. And then we sort of deployed it. We deployed it in the river, and we brought the William Penn Foundation to the mock-up. And we told them the story about the Schuylkill and how the Schuylkill had evolved over time and how bringing citizens back to their river would be really important to sort of reconnect them to this history and to this place. And so they gave us $2 million to build the float lab. So that's, I think, a great sort of success. It's not like the client said, build a submarine. We said, what can we do to bring people to the river? Maybe a submarine. So that's another kind of lesson. The last chapter in the book, how am I doing on time? Is it okay? I said there was one more chapter. This is really a kind of an appendix. The last chapter in the book, we called it Feed, because we do think there is a pace of broadcast where nobody waits for a book before they see a project. They see the project on Instagram, way before it's ever built. And so there's a kind of speed of information. There's a speed of working with information. And we thought, maybe the last chapter in the book could be more about current projects, like projects on the books. And could we talk more about the way we work and the way we sort of practice and the kinds of things we do? This is the early rotomolder. How is that practice sort of conveyed in the book? What kind of projects could we show on the boards? And so there's two more projects I want to show. This one is in Chengdu again. So this looks like Chinese urbanism, right? It's a big piece of a city. It's sort of connected to the center with the highway and a subway line. This client called us up. He said, we're looking for you to design a hotel. So this is, just to give you a sense of scale, like that is our site. This is the developer's parcel, and that's Lower Manhattan. That's downtown Boston. So they're developing a parcel which is almost the size of Lower Manhattan. They asked us to do parcel D, and it's that one project there that I want to show you. We've been looking at techniques, right? How do you sort of subtract a figure from another figure? How do you create that sort of legible a kind of figural void? And so we proposed this idea of a hotel in Chengdu. It's got 18 rooms up here. This is the lobby level, and this is the restaurant level. So learning a little bit from our previous experience with these kind of operations, we pitched this idea of the hotel as a kind of topography, as a kind of landscape that begins with the kind of water feature, brings you up into the lobby, and then ultimately up into the rooms. Whenever we work in China, we try to bring models that really sort of convey a lot. Our first experience, we were sharing these structural models. Now we bring physical models with all the kind of members shown so that we can sort of coordinate in these sort of marathon coordination sessions. So the idea is that we have a kind of megatruss that supports the hotel rooms above, and then it hangs the sort of ceilings below. And then the landscape is basically just standing from the ground level. And so that's the megatruss that sort of supports that and then hangs that. But this one's sort of on the boards. We're just sort of developing this in design development with the client. It's a different developer from last time. This one doesn't have any Chinese feeling requirements. But I think it does have the kind of show us something unique, show us something spectacular. And so when we think about attention and distraction, it's very easy to sort of slide into the realm of spectacle. And we want to be very careful about that. We don't want to sort of make gratuitous form and gratuitous gestures just to do so. But we are sort of working carefully with, thinking about the user experience from the inside, looking through these screens, what's that experience like, moving around a building, how can they read their environment, how does the building sort of communicate something about where they are in the building and around the building. These are sort of plans in development. That's the kind of structural diagram. Anyways, I wanted to show something sort of on the boards. This is something we've been working on with their hotel group and their operator to sort of figure out how does the landscape sort of meet basic questions of code and accessibility. How do we sort of build something that's both ground and ceiling in terms of what material is it made of? And how do we sort of convey these things when we work in a kind of global context where language isn't always the easiest way to communicate. So that's on the boards. Not yet. I'm going to Chengdu in a couple weeks, so I'll see if they're building it. I don't think so. Not yet. Okay, one last project, and then I'm really done. The University of Virginia is famously designed by Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson designed the academical village with the rotunda, these 10 pavilions. These are kind of Palladian architectures. Jefferson sort of created the image of a kind of ideal campus, an ideal sort of space for learning, where reason would prevail, truth, and all these sort of ideals. But within this sort of picture postcard image of the kind of the ideal American city, the kind of utopia, there's a kind of hidden history, right? We know that Jefferson owned slaves. The slaves that worked in these houses were actually housed on lower levels that faced the gardens behind. And so all the kind of picture perfect image of UVA sort of concealed a kind of infrastructure of human labor, slave labor, that was enslaved in the construction and the operation of the university. And so if you look in this rendering right here, the image of this kind of pristine utopia is somehow clouded by the fact that the slave is actually taking care of the child, and that is the sort of human infrastructure that makes this whole operation work. A few years ago, the students at UVA learned this history, and they demanded that the university acknowledge it, that they make something permanent to address this history that was known but not celebrated, and somehow buried and hidden sort of underneath. And so, as we were sort of preparing for this project at the DNC, Michelle Obama said, "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." And that, for many people, was the first time they realized that so much of our architecture, our cities, were built at a time where slave labor was the only way to build. And so UVA was going through a similar sort of crisis. In Charlottesville, there is a statue of General Lee. And so when we interviewed for this project, we said, what's the relationship between that statue of General Lee and the sort of unfinished, unresolved problems with Jefferson's legacy and the university and the descendants of the slaves that live in Charlottesville? So we interviewed for this project. We sort of raised these questions. And to our surprise, they hired us to design this memorial. And before we could design anything, we spent 6 months in this sort of community engagement process. So we met with churches, we met with schools, we met with faculty, staff, leadership, and we learned a lot about the history of UVA. And we were thinking, where would a memorial be appropriate? This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so they said, don't even think about doing anything there. Maybe you could do something there, or maybe there, or maybe there. But we designed a bunch of different sort of strategies. And when you think about the kind of magnitude of something like institutionalized slavery, what can architecture do as a response to that? How can you make that history legible? Incredibly hard to do anything that would somehow convey the kind of dread, the violence, the kind of that history. So we conceived of a scheme that would serve as a kind of counter-monument to the dome. The dome is Jefferson's sort of tour de force. It's a kind of 80-foot diameter. We thought maybe instead of a dome, a bowl. So instead of this, we go like this. And there was an idea that maybe we could create a clearing in the woods. There were lots of stories about slaves gathering in the woods in secret to worship or to gather. And so we thought maybe we could create a clearing within a wood. And so we pitched this idea of a kind of a bowl-shaped figure in the landscape. And it's really an earthwork. It's not really a piece of architecture. And in a way, it can't be architecture because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So there's kind of prohibitions about new structures, but an earthwork is actually appropriate. And if you think about Jefferson's sort of masterful manipulation of the ground and the topography that allowed for that pristine image and the kind of submerging of the slave quarters in the landscape, it seems somehow fitting that a memorial to the slaves on UVA's campus would somehow incorporate an element of topography and earthwork. On the exterior, we have some carving. On the interior, we have 5,000 names that need to be recognized. So here we started to look at textures that would somehow convey some of the kind of coarseness or the traces of the tools that were used by the slaves to carve stone. On the inside, we wanted to carve in up to 5,000 names. There's a lot of dispute about how many slaves worked on UVA's campus. The estimates are up to 5,000. There are only 953 actual records, but oftentimes the records don't really convey very much. Maybe it says Jacob Male, no last name, because these were property records. They weren't sort of recording humans. They were recording property. And so there are very few names that we can carve. And so how do we think about, what's an appropriate way to acknowledge 5,000 sort of presences without knowing what their names were? And so incredibly difficult to sort of design for that sort of unknowability. And when it was approved by the Board of Visitors at UVA, an article appeared in the Washington Post recognizing certain slaves that have been liberated, like Isabella Gibbons, who became a teacher, and some of her writing will be carved into the wall. Then this happened. Last summer, a group of neo-Nazis showed up on UVA's campus under the banner of Unite the Right. They chose UVA because of the statue of General Lee, which was a kind of controversy. The city was contemplating taking that down. And so these guys showed up very deliberately to parade in front of the rotunda, right? They didn't pick any old building. They picked Thomas Jefferson's masterpiece to parade in front of and to say, well, I'm not sure what their message was, but I do think they're exploiting the kind of ambiguity of UVA's sort of legacy, saying that, well, if Jefferson owned slaves, that seems like a kind of gray area. They can associate themselves with Jefferson and slave owners, while UVA hasn't updated their sort of stance on this. They haven't come clean, and they haven't sort of acknowledged the sort of history of the slavery that exists on the university. And so while we were designing, these guys showed up, and I think after these guys showed up, I think it means that the university needs to acknowledge this history in a very direct way and say unequivocally, this was wrong. We need to begin to sort of remediate that past. We need to right these past wrongs. And first of all, they need to acknowledge that wrong. And so making those histories legible, accessible, prominent, I think would start to begin the conversation that would undo the kind of this kind of activity and this kind of sort of political showcasing. In any case, for us, this project is ongoing. We're sort of in construction documents. Actually, this went out to bid, and we plan to begin construction in the spring. But the lesson here, I think, for us is how do we sort of design an architecture that can be a platform for, not just for political gathering, but also for kind of a way to communicate, again, knowledge and education, in this case, a hidden history, in explicit terms that have a chance to impact kind of people's behavior, people's political opinions, and ultimately their sort of actions. So maybe I'll stop at that. Thank you.